I was painting some of these Kroot from Warhammer 40k with my 11-year-old son, and he really enjoyed painting this scheme, and also the results came out pretty well. So if you want to see how he went from this to this, and also if you want to see how the boy did, then let's go. So within 40k, Kroot can come in quite large squads. So therefore I want to try and make this as easy as I can to batch paint and not lose the will to live after doing 15, 20 of these guys. So the first step is priming, and I've primed these in a black Mecha primer from Vallejo. Now this was done by an airbrush, but you could easily do this by hand with a paintbrush as well. Now once that's dry, what we did was we started with the base. So for this I've already added some texture before I primed it. Now if you want to see more detail on how I do this, then you might want to check out the video in the top right corner right now. Now the first layer of paint to go on here is going to be a desert yellow from Tamiya. Now, this is quite a nice, comparatively thick paint, but it still flows very nicely and is ideal for this job. So using a large brush and not even thinning it at all, I'm just going to paint it over and coat the entire thing. So as I mentioned before, Kroot can be used in quite large squads. So for each step we're going to go through today, then you can easily do it by individual model, or you can batch paint it and do 5, 10, how many you want to do at the same time. So while I'm doing that, a question for you. So when you're batch painting, how many models do you do at a time without losing the will to live? Can you do a massive amount or 1 or 2 at a time? Let me know down in the comments. So now that's dry, I want to add a little bit of definition into that base. Now remember, this is not a display piece, there's going to be tons of these guys. So I always want to add a little bit of definition into the base. So to do this, I want to use a wash over that sand yellow. Now you could use black, but that is very, very harsh. Now this one is by Vallejo Model Color, and it is a German Camouflage black brown. Now this is quite an earthy, dark brown color, but it is still quite thick. So I'm going to put this onto the wet palette and dilute it down so it's really nice and thin and flows beautifully. And after that, just wash it over the entire base, just making sure it's not pooling or going too deep or too thick in areas. Okay, so onto the Kroot skin. Now Kroot are ambush predators, so I want it to be quite shadowy and dark, but the same thing, I don't want it to be just a green blob. So first of all, I'm going to work on the deep shadow. So I'm going to use this Camouflage dark green from Vallejo Model Air and mix that on the wet palette with this black from Army Painter. Now the Army Painter paint is a lot thicker, a lot gloopier than the Vallejo Model Air range. So it will thicken and add a little bit of body to that green paint. Now for this entire model, I'm going to use just one brush. And this is number 2 from the Series 33 Kolinsky Sable range by Rosemary & Co. Now I like this one because the body of the brush is big enough to hold lots of paint, but at the same time it holds a really nice, beautiful sharp point for the detail work. And in this scheme, having that sharp point is going to be very handy. So this very dark green mix is, well, more of a greeny black than dark green. Now the idea of this is to be that deep shadow, and this is coated over all the skin areas of the Kroot. So later on, the areas that I don't paint in lighter colours, and you'll see what I mean later, then the areas you'll see will be a very, very dark green rather than pure black. The colour change in this is very, very minimal from that black to greeny black. So you could, if you wanted to, skip this stage completely, but I am a glutton for punishment, so I'm going to do it. Okay, so that's now covered in that. So now I'm going to add a lighter green. So I'm going to use that Camouflage dark green as it is. Now with this one, I'm not trying to cover the entire thing. I only want to start painting the raised areas. So for example, if you look at my hand here, if I brush the brush over the top of my fingers, you can see where the brush is covering the raised areas, but the recessed areas are still that base undercoat. And this will help some of the contrast, but also it helps to give it quite a sketchy, shadowy sort of effect. Now I'm going to come back to the skin in a minute, but whilst that's drying, I'm going to use this beige by Army Painter and just sketch out little sketchy strokes with the tip of the paintbrush and use that to paint out the chest piece and the belly of the Kroot. Now once again, Army Painter is quite a thickish paint, so you're going to want to dilute this down and water it down a little bit. So those first 2 coats of paint, we put in that very deep dark shadow, but also then sort of a slightly lighter shadow as well. So now it's time to put in that kind of mid-main kind of colour. So for this, I'm going to use Gunship Green by Vallejo Model Air. Now if I put this next to that Camouflage dark green, you can see that the Gunship green is a lot brighter colour than the first layer we put down. And on this I'm going to start once again doing those more of the raised areas, but start to build up the highlights a little bit. So it's still very sketchy. So I'm trying to use the tip of the paintbrush and just kind of sketch in around the muscles and in the prominent features of the face. I do not want to cover the whole lot. I just want the paint to be on those prominent areas. Now the next step is a very, very light grey. Now I'm going to use this grey from iPainter mixed up with some of this white from Vallejo Model Air. Once again, a thicker paint with a much thinner paint, but I want a very, very almost off-white grey. And with this, I want to paint in kind of the tunic, sash kind of thing, as well as the wrappings on the rifle. Now the final step of the skin is I'm going to use that grey we just mixed up and mix that in with the green we used for the last layer on the skin. And with this, I'm going to use on the brightest highlights. Now this mix of the iPainter and the Vallejo paints gives it quite a nice kind of slightly dusty matte effect, which can give it much more of a biological look rather than a plasticky kind of look. Now to accentuate this even more, I'm going to use tiny little scratchy, sketchy brush strokes just to paint in those highlights. Also to add a bit more definition into the face, I'm going to make that lower jaw of the Kroot a lot greyer than the green, more greeny areas of the upper face. So the next step is going to be painting the wooden areas, the brown areas of the rifle. So using that German black brown that we had right at the very start, I'm going to pick out the stock as well as the muzzle parts of this rifle. And if you want to, you can use some of that beige we used before, just to add a bit of grain into that kind of wooden rifle stock. Oh yeah, and I completely forgot earlier on to paint in the grey on the wrappings around the barrel. So yeah, we'll quickly catch up on that now. So on this rifle barrel, I've used the metallic black from Vallejo Model Air. But when it comes to the ton of blades on this guy, I'm going to mix up some silver from the Vallejo Model Air, mix it in with some of that metallic black, and then paint that over those blades. And then going back with silver over the cutting edges. At the minute, he's looking very green and brown, and if I'm honest, a bit dull. So as the Kroot are very reptilian, let's add in a bit of reptile flair. So for starters, I'm going to use this rust and paint that over the top of the head, but also through those spines as well. I don't want any black showing through now. I want this rust colour to be the base undercoat. Okay, so now we want a nice striking yellow to go through these spines. Now for a striking yellow, I'm going to use the Citadel colour Phalanx Yellow. Now this is a lot thicker paint than the Vallejo Model Air, for example, or even the Army Painter, and it's a lot brighter. And also because it's thicker, then it tends to hold the shape of where you put it on as well. It doesn't flow out into the recesses quite as easily as, say, the Vallejo Model Air, for example. Now often they say to dilute Citadel paint, but for this particular job, I'm not going to. I'm going to use it neat. And once again, on the very tip of the paintbrush, and sketch it over those spines. This means that the spines are a very bright yellow, but then the background colour is that orangey rusty colour, which works quite well. But also having that orangey base colour over the black also means that the yellow is going to be brighter as well. Now the final step on the head is to add in some red, but also it will add some contrast and some visual interest against that green and then flowing down into the yellow. Now once again, I'm not putting this on thick, little sketchy strokes from front to back and just flow it into those yellow spines. Now once again, this is helped and supported by the undercoat of that rust colour as well. Now within the game, Kroot are ambush predators. So they like to ambush something, kill it, and then carry chunks of it around to snack on later on. Now there are a ton of ways you can paint raw meat, but also bear in mind that I've got tons of these guys to do. So I'm going to do quite a nice simple scheme. So I'm going to start off with that rust over the black primer, then going over the meaty part of that with that fire red from Vallejo, and adding in a bit of a dark wash in between the ribs to add a bit of definition. And to finish it off, a little bit of beige over the ends of the bones coming through. Okay, so it's not looking too bad at the moment, but those spines across the head is looking, well, quite yellow. So what I'm going to do next is take some pure black and just paint little stripes over it. Now on this one, you notice I'm not going from top to bottom down the entire thing, because then it looks like it's got hazard stripes on his hair. But instead, I'm staggering out the little black strips to make it look a bit more random and organic. And yeah, like I said, it doesn't look like he has hazard stripes painted over his head. And the next step is a little one, but it makes quite a big difference. So very simply using that beige that we used right at the very start and just picking out the spines coming through on his arms and legs. That very light colour also helps to break up that green as well. So I'm looking forward to the final step. This makes it look awesome. But first, I'm going to use a very nice chocolate brown and just pick out some of the highlights on the brown of the rifle, but also just to tidy up and finish off the rim of the base. Okay, on to the finishing touch. Now this bit is one of my favourite bits. This bit makes it look awesome. Now this is the Delta Violet ink from Magic Colour. Now this is a really nice, deep and bold purpley kind of colour. Now for this, drop it onto the wet palette and then using the very tip of the brush, just paint in some tribal markings, both on his shoulder pauldron and his tunic, but also on his weapon as well. So that's how I went from this to this. But how did my son do? And this is the one that Zach, my 11-year-old, painted. Yeah, boy did good. So if you enjoyed that, you found that useful, please hit the like button, and I'll see you in this next video right here.